Truth and reconciliation in schools. What does it take to shift the system? Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of your co-hosts, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. We're retired educators who worked in Ontario in neighboring school districts using restorative practices. And now we're coaching principals in restorative practices, and we've got a couple of podcasts. Our guest this week is Dr. Ngieng, Deputy Superintendent of Abby Schools in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He puts principals at the center of the drive for systemic change and reconciliation in schools.
This podcast is brought to you by the word drive from Old English to push or propel something forward. It was used in the sense of herding livestock in order to urge them forward. In modern automotive usage, drivers have a duty of care for the passengers in the vehicle and for their safety. Drivers have multiple tasks: process vast amounts of information, watch traffic signs and signals, road conditions, pedestrians, and other vehicles. As a school driver, principals also have multiple tasks: process vast amounts of information, watch for signs and signals, and watch out for other staff, parents, and students. Principals are the drivers of change in schools.
Now it's time to take 5. Your feedback helps shape future discussions on restorative leadership for principals. Can you take just 5 minutes to click on the link in the podcast description? We'd appreciate it. Our website is www.restorative.ca. It's for principals who deal with conflict, who want to make it right, and who want to make it about kids. Student learning. All of this making you feel even more overwhelmed in your busy role? Email me, stan@restorative.ca. Shelley's away this week, so let's join your hosts, Steve and me, Stan.
There's two sides to leadership that I look at. There's the management side, how to run your school. And there's a definite need for that in terms of scheduling, some of the structures and the systems. And Margaret Wheatley talks about that particular piece, which is this concept of the above and below the green line. And above the green line being these kind of structures and process and things that we need to do. And the deeper learning piece for us has been, how do we dive below the green line, which is really more the human aspect, right? How do we make sense of the information? How do we foster and nurture relationships and to make sense of what we're seeing in the system, to move the system? And you need a combination of the two. And so we do a lot of work. We have some structures here in our school district that focus on, I'll say, nuts and bolts, right? Staffing, budgets, all those really important things that you have to have as a leader, but I would say are more management type pieces. But then we have the piece around, I'll say, the more clearly leadership pieces, the instructional leadership. I would say more of the heart work in terms of leading a staff towards a common vision, right? And we talk about, for leaders, one of the important pieces in creating change in the system is for people to buy into or understand and see themselves in that change process. And that's really been what the deeper learning experience for us has been. To really at a fundamental level, create some vulnerability, to examine things that are not going well, to learn together with some openness and vulnerability. And that's been the truth reconciliation piece. So here in Abbotsford, we've really focused on examining some of the practices, some of the things that are happening that might be creating systemic barriers specific to our Indigenous students, and recognizing some of the gaps that exist. But also, I think what we've seen with the work is that we've seen some really great successes for our Indigenous students, and as a result, for our system. So if our Indigenous students are thriving and flourishing, that means the system is as well, right? We have one of the measures of a system is graduation rates, and we have one of the highest in the province, sitting just over 90%. And what we know is that while we have a gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners, we know in comparison to other districts, they're actually doing quite well. But our resolve to make sure that we tackle the gap keeps us focused on this work that we know needs to address, and I historical information or misinformation, and to engage our leaders in some of those conversations that just reaffirm their commitments, right? And so that the example would be some of the sessions that I had this morning, right?
You said you had a meeting this morning with
Yeah.
principals and vice principals, middle school, and you set up a bit of a structure. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so what we try to do is set aside some, I'll say, learning time with our leaders, middle school in this particular case. And we really center around a focus for the year. So when I begin my planning, this would have been back in the 23-24 school year, looking forward, recognizing the importance of this. I'll say in the spring of 24, we signed off on our enhancement agreements with our Indigenous, both the Samath First Nation and Mathquit First Nation, as well as our Métis representation. And this outlined commitments and actions we were going to engage in as a school district. So areas related to equitable access, student success, etc. As a part of that, strategically thinking, what do we need to do to put our leaders in a position to enact this work? I have a structure called a middle advance, which are 4 meetings that we schedule for a couple of hours throughout the year. So in my thinking with that and looking at where we were with the work, I wanted to have a focus on Indigenous education and supporting our knowledge and understanding of history. And so we're very fortunate. We have an individual who works for the University of Fraser Valley. His name is Dr. Keith Carlson, who has spent many years in this area and specific to the local Fraser Valley and some of the implications of colonization and the history of colonization and its impact on First Nations. And we've had Keith come in 3 times so far. The first time that Keith came in, we did what was called the land exercise. He's been working on this protocol to examine what colonization did here in the Fraser Valley, the implications of the land and the impact it's had for the Mathquit First Nation and the Samath First Nation in particular, with the shrinking of lands that were assigned to them and the impact on culture as a result of colonization. And you walk through these experiences. So we had all of our middle leaders participate in this, and that was the first session that we did over at our Indigenous Center, followed by 2, I'll say, more lecture conversation sessions that kind of mapped out history. Today's session we had was very interesting because the focus was on when we're interacting with students and interacting with families who are Indigenous, the consideration of the perspective that we take and to understand the impact of historical events. And so we learned about some things that I was not aware of. I'll say children being taken away from First Nation Indigenous families here in BC, the implications for that. And so while we often talk about the traumatic experience of residential schools, that is only part of the generational impact for families. And so he just mapped out a number of different aspects for us to consider and understand historically that really gave us a better perspective on why there's such generally a distrust of the school system. To give us a different perspective to take when we're working with and supporting Indigenous students who might be struggling with engagement and the implications of the history from a parental experience as well.
How did the educators respond to that? Because when you think about it,
right,
it's no wonder that Indigenous families have a hard time with schools. But how did the people who are leading the schools respond to that kind of information?
I think when you hear about his perspective of understanding the accumulation of, and just being open to understanding that it's not just residential schools. And I think you hear a lot of narratives to consider the perspective of why. I think what I saw around the room with administrators was we talk about the commitments and the obligations to understand history. We have a commitment statement here in Abbotsford, and it talks about renewing respectful relationships with our First Nation, to understanding the miseducation historically that has happened, and to learn. And so when you reaffirm that commitment and you walk into these kinds of sessions with an open mind, I think you begin to see things in a different light. And it's not a blame game. It's not a pointing a finger at any particular. It's an understanding of the consequences of history and understanding a little bit more about the facts of what happened. And so I think that was one, to hear stories that, or information we hadn't heard before, to consider it within the context of what might create a foundation of mistrust within the public education system with our Indigenous students and families. And then to begin to see that's really where that idea of truth and reconciliation, to really commit to our understanding of history, and then the steps we need to make, right, in term, and part of that is perspective taking, to understand and to be compassionate when dealing with difficult circumstances.
I'm wondering how, when you're working with your leaders, how it then trickles down from them into the school, and what is there time being spent with your leaders when you're together to say, okay, now when you go back to your schools, here's some things you may want to consider. It's not just about awareness and understanding. It's about how do we actionalize this so that all the teachers are now singing from the same page, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, and this goes back, for me, it's a connection with our deeper learning piece and a theory of change. And so part of the theory of change really talks about one aspect. When we look at it, it's about the three concepts. Equity is, or inequity is structural. This idea that we have leadership for the emergence of ideas. And then the third piece being the concept of symmetry. So one of the premises is that what the work that I'm doing with our leaders should be symmetrical to the work that they do with teachers. And that teachers, that work will be symmetrical with the work that teachers do with students. For example, I talked about, today's session was mostly about listening to and understanding some information and history. There are artifacts that they can bring back to their staff. But the example I'll give is, coming up in April, we're going to be asking one of our school leaders to lead a session for our middle leaders of what's happening in their school. They've been working with one of their Indigenous support workers and an Indigenous student around plants that are Indigenous and the application of those plants in terms of creating ointments or things that are natural remedies, and the importance of that from an Indigenous perspective. And that comes from understanding sustainability and implications for our impact on the land. And they're going to bring that back to our administrators as an example of what's transpired as a result of the work that we've done. Back in the fall, we had an opportunity with our school leaders to take them on a place-based experience with an elder by the name of Darren Charlie on Harrison Lake to understand history and stories. Darren walked us through, as we were on a boat, the different stories that exist within the local First Nation around particular landmarks and the implications for the stories that sometimes we hear or don't hear, right? A very place-based experience, because that mirrors what we create in our middle schools for all of our grade 8 Indigenous students, what we call the Paddle Project. Because we, over the course of the last few years, as I'll say, end of middle school experience, take our Indigenous students on a paddle project on Harrison Lake. So this idea that we're mirroring and trying to create experiences for our leaders in this area of truth and reconciliation and broadening our understanding of history and Indigenous education. that we see that happening in staff meetings. And so there's a commitment from our leaders because they're learning through experiencing, that they're working with staff on this. And then the example I gave is then some work happening with teachers, with students around replicating some of that experiential, which is now being brought back to the administrator group as an example of what's happening in our school. And we can have many examples of that happening to know that it's an uneven application. Every school has its own context, and people are at different places with this, but it's encouraging and supporting them to continue to move forward. Again, framed with this idea of a theory of change around how we're trying to enact some of these pieces.
What kinds of things have you noticed in the principal, vice principal group that have enhanced this learning, and what kinds of things have inhibited that learning together?
Yeah, it's it requires a level of vulnerability, right? That accept that we've done some things that maybe have been harmful, right? As a system, even individually, not knowing, right? And so it's that ability to walk into this saying, hey, we're going to learn together, we're going to take some risk, and trying to get to create a culture where there's some openness, right? And again, this is multi-year work, and to empower them to do this work with their staff. There are little bumps along the way too, and we've had some of those, right? Really difficult circumstances where things have not perhaps gone as well from what's happened in schools, but that shouldn't deter us from moving forward and continuing to push. So I think there was probably some tentative pieces in the beginning around, we don't want to do this wrong. And that was probably reflected with their staff. We don't want to do this wrong. But I think our work together, and it's really that I'm there with them, learning in the same way, that we're experiencing this together. If I go back to our commitment statement as a district, part of that's renewing respectful relationships. And I would say the work of our Indigenous education department. So we have an outstanding district principal who is engaged with them. And what I'll say are some very strong relationships we have with Samath First Nation and Mathwee First Nation. Specifically, we have a longhouse through Samath and many opportunities to be engaged and join them in the longhouse for ceremony and other events. And so I think that's been really helpful because the relationships are there. So people aren't afraid to ask, they aren't afraid to try. Structurally, we've committed as a district to staffing levels that support this. So each of our middle schools has an Indigenous support worker. And then we've moved to have more Indigenous support teacher time in our middle schools as well, right? And again, it's just this ability to support them in areas that they need support, like to be responsive, right? If this is our vision and this is what we're working towards, equipping them structurally with the tools and the staffing to do some of this important but hard work.
The bumps and things not going actually teach us a lot and actually shape our practice. Can you speak more specifically, maybe some stories of how the bumps occurred, like what the bump was maybe, and how it changed or shaped your practice?
It's one of the pieces we do. We recognize that systemic racism exists. And despite a lot of the work that's being done, we know we're still getting instances of that. So one of the pieces we've done with our leaders, so again, we went to our Indigenous support workers and we actually went to our Indigenous students. So part of this is the ability to have voice from particular populations in the system to understand what they're grappling with on a day-to-day basis. And I would say we were surprised because when we went out and collected some of the thoughts from students and Indigenous support workers in our middle schools, what came back were comments that were a little bit disheartening around, that's not important work, or that's not my job. If only they would just engage in a better way, right? But our group was at a point where we could face that. So we actually had an exercise where we said we took our enhancement agreement and looked at the priority areas. I said, again, student success, equity and access, etc. And we have a number of commitment and actions, and we overlaid these comments, and we said, these comments don't actually match what we've committed to. And we spent some time to dig into that as a group, right? Again, not to blame, not to finger point, but to say we still have lots of work to do, because the experiences for some of our Indigenous support workers and for some of our Indigenous students and families is still not great. They are still faced with issues of racism and barriers that would not reflect where we want to head to with our work. And I think a great first step was for us, one, to be able to bring that to the surface, and to have some conversations as a leadership group about being aware of and committing to continue to work to change some of the perspectives. Because if you went and asked people, they wouldn't say that they're racist. But again, it just speaks to the perspective taking around what, I'll say, unconscious bias an individual might hold around what they know and their experiences in this area.
That takes some courageous leadership to actually, on your part, to actually say, let's look at what we agreed to and let's overlay what we found out from student voice. And there's a disconnect here.
The first time we did it for our leadership group, I could see, I don't think they were expecting it, right? Because of the work that was happening. But to hear from the people who are faced with it, one, to get to that place where we would actually get that authentic feedback, and two, the ability to sit with it in a reflective way, I think speaks a lot to the group and their willingness to commit to this. It's really a test of their leadership, right? Because you can discount it in a number of different ways. That's not me. That's not what I'm hearing. There's so many reasons why you could explain that away, and they didn't. They sat with it. It reaffirmed the commitment, and really the basis of the work. I'm incredibly lucky to work with such a committed leadership group. But I would go back to the importance of setting up a system that supports your leaders in this really tough work, right? When I think about what the important work is, at the end of the day, this is the really important work, is this is helping to shape the future leaders, right? And whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, the importance of understanding of how we need to recognize and understand history and how we move together, right? Together to make this a better place, especially in the context of everything that's happening today. That's really what we want for our young people, right? Critical thinkers, good communicators, and individuals that can collaborate and understand the importance of diversity.
Principals are in the driver's seat to create meaningful change in Indigenous education, reconciliation, and by addressing systemic barriers within each school. It's the power of the leader's vulnerability and engagement in continuous learning with the staff. Principals can flatten the school hierarchy by empowering voice at all levels and by building trust among students, parents, teachers, and principals. We're not stopping at this conversation. We want your perspective too. So what resonates with you? What challenges do you face? Take a few minutes to share your thoughts in the feedback form listed in the podcast description. You've got the wheel, so drive the truth and reconciliation at your school. But wait, fear and anxiety about getting it wrong got you spinning? Email me, stan@restorative.ca.